Hello, everyone. Welcome to Everything is Gay, Even the Straight Stuff. It is Pride Month. It is June. We made it. It's officially halfway through the year, or whatever June is for straight people. I'm John McDonald, one of your favorite pop culture connoisseurs, and I'm here again with my lovely co-host Magnus, who we are celebrating this month because it is their birth month, and they are definitely worth celebrating.
Oh, always such a gentleman. And
I try, but thank you. Yes.
I'm sure June has some more things to be celebrated than just the happenstance of my creation, shall we
I
say.
mean, there's Pride Month, but I'm a big
Mm,
advocate for Pride Month celebrations that aren't brought to you by alcohol companies because there are a lot of queer people that are in recovery programs, and so I have kind
yes.
of a love-hate relationship with the idea of Pride Month and consumerism and capitalism because the
Mm,
original Pride, quite famously, in Stonewall and right before that at Randy's Donuts, was a legitimate riot.
mm,
So it's one of those things. But we're gonna celebrate you this month. I'm kind of excited
mm,
about this premise and to see where we go. So this
mm,
was your idea, and I'd love for you to be able to explain it to everyone, kind of what we're going to talk about today.
mm. So I thought to start things off for this month, um, rather than focusing on a particular film or book or such, that the theme for this episode of our podcast should be looking at the men of Marvel, looking at the leading men that we've seen in various Marvel films, be it from the MCU to Fox's iterations of Marvel films, um, Sony's take as well, and so forth. And just have a look at these leading men, see the impact that these roles have had on themselves, the public, and dare I say, gay artistry.
Yes.
And
Um,
generally, sort of what they bring and how it's sort of shifted over time.
so here's something interesting too that I kind of want to talk about because we are going
Mm,
to. I'm going to spoil this because this is kind of my addition to the idea. Is that next episode we'll talk about DC.
mm,
And something interesting DC does that Marvel hasn't done historically, and I have the list of all Marvel films from 1986's Howard the Duck to the present.
mm,
1986, obviously, Disney didn't own Marvel, and Marvel didn't have a superhero market in 1986. So there are some things I want to talk about, but when we think about Marvel, the reason we're going to be talking about men and queering men is because there aren't a lot of female queer characters even in Marvel comics, and there certainly aren't really the only openly gay female Marvel character, or probably pansexual. I'm not actually sure how she describes herself, but the only one that I can particularly think of is Mystique, and the Mystique in the movies, played by Jennifer Lawrence and Rebecca Romijn, really only was played as a straight character. And so
mm.
we've never seen Destiny in the Marvel movies, and if she's
No.
going to be in a future one, I don't know. But there's not really a canonical female presence. So, except for maybe allusions to Elektra or Halle Berry's Catwoman, which Catwoman is obviously a DC. So when we do DC month, there'll be a bit more because we'll talk about Suicide Squad and Harley Quinn a little bit, and we'll talk about Catwoman, who is a fabulous queer icon for both lesbians and gay men. But for Marvel MCU, there really is, when we think about the superheroes, even focuses on Black Widow seem to focus on the men in Black Widow's life more than Black Widow.
Mm,
So, like, for us, it's not just a phallic thing, it's also what has been offered by the studio itself and the point of view they have. For better or for worse, and that could be its own talking point one day, but just to give
mm,
people, like, we're not excluding the lesbians, we just really don't have any lesbians to talk about that I can think of. Even if
mm,
Jubilee is bisexual, I don't think they've ever come across that. I guess maybe potentially Rogue, but
mm.
even in the Xmen, bisexuality is more of a male dominated field in a way. So, yeah.
Yes. Within for the within MCU for representation, Valkyrie is canonically bisexual. I'm not sure they don't really demonstrate that
They
so
actually cut the
too much.
scene where she had a
Mm,
girlfriend in the Thor movie where
yeah.
they were like, she's our big bisexual woman character, and then they like cut her girlfriend completely out of it or
Yeah.
something.
There is lesbian representation within Marvel Comics per se, but n- if I remember correctly, not many of them, if any, have really come across to the MCU as of yet. And certainly we haven't really seen it as an issue for the other Marvel movies from the other studios that were done.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, gay representation in general has been rather poor, but that's not stopped people from imagining their own representation, shall we
Yeah,
say.
even in the gay Marvel porn that I think men.com did, because I remember this is
Mm,
before we all hated Colby Keller. He played Wolverine in that. I don't think they had any of the female X-Men represented
mm.
all in that porn. Even when they did the gay Justice League for men.com, like
Yeah.
Manila Luzon played Wonder Woman, which was hilarious. But we're gonna talk about Marvel, so unless
Mm,
you have an objection to this, what I'd like to do is just kind of go through from the start in 1986 and
mm.
talk a little bit about kind of the moments and the characters that read more queer or took a place of queer honor later.
Mm.
Because we do have some moments before what I'm calling the second coming in 2011, which is where it all starts to get a little wild with Captain America, X-Men First Class, and Thor, which is where I really
Yes,
think it really starts. But there are some things before that that are quite popular that we can talk about.
I quite agree. And I think I might know at least a few of those moments you're speaking of, certainly
It's
from a
kind
personal perspective.
Well, it's also interesting because I have some where I'm curious as to why this never picked up. So I'm thinking about Tobey Maguire and James Franco as Spider-Man and Harry Osborn. Kind of the perfect fatal attraction best friend to lovers trope, but it never caught on. I never saw
Mm,
any fan fiction or art pairing of them, even though there was kind of a fatal
yeah.
love triangle thing. So what we got with Wolverine, Jean Grey, and Cyclops later on, we don't get with Toby Spider-Man
Mm.
and Franco Harry Osborn. And so I'm curious about
Yeah.
that. If you came across that,
I,
or if you feel like, yeah.
so is that initial point you want to touch upon? Um,
My first point
Start
would
with.
be that Stephen Dorff as Deacon
Mm.
Frost and Blade was super hunky, and I love that Randy Meeks keeps bringing him back. But I feel kind of alone on the hunky Deacon Frost island because Stephen Dorff hasn't done anything in a while. So I feel like people kind of forget that Blade is a Marvel movie, and it was actually
Mm.
one of the first ones. So
I think the success of Blade actually set started to set the floor for Marvel movies as almost like their own subgenre of cinema. Um, because before that, they'd had quite a number of failed attempts. They'd had some success with animated series and what have you, some of which became quite iconic in their own right. But Blade, I think, was the first Marvel character that really took off, and this was before Spider-Man with Tobey Maguire.
it was 2 years before Spider-Man, the first Blade
Mm.
movie, but they did market it more as a vampire movie. When I saw it in '98,
Mm.
I knew that Spawn was kind of a DC creation, but if
Yeah.
you had told me Blade was a Marvel vampire anti-hero, I would have
Mm.
not been prepared for that because they didn't craft it as a superhero movie, and I think that's part of why Blade worked.
Mm.
The side characters in Blade are great. What's interesting is what Randy Meeks does is he creates this kind of relationship between Deacon Frost and Blade, which totally doesn't exist in the movie anywhere. But
Mm.
I was such a big fan of Deacon Frost, Stephen Dorff's version of Deacon Frost, that like I can totally see where Randy's coming from, and I definitely appreciated Blade. Not quite as a sexual awakening movie, but I actually think Blade is probably one of the Marvel sleeper hits from before Marvel was a big box office studio thing.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yes. No, I could definitely agree with you with that. And it is to the point where um Blade has actually been mentioned in recent times of being revisited at some point, being brought back into the fold, as it were. Um, but I wonder whether they're going to incorporate the Blade movies in some way as one of the new Marvel alternative universe iterations.
I mean, if they can make Kelsey Grammer into the Beast, they can make anyone. So here's the thing: famously, Wesley Snipes didn't actually enjoy being Blade, so they could recast it, and they could probably cast someone that actually would like enjoy their job. I will say,
Mm.
by the time we get to Blade Trinity, where we get Ryan Reynolds in his like early
I
beefcake
was
phase, that's
Yes.
a good time right there. That's a good time for everybody. We have quite a bit of a gap between them. I will say after Blade, unless you have anything else to say about Blade,
I was about to comment about Ryan Reynolds being in Blade 3 because I
he
think that
was in Blade
that
3.
might that might be something that people forget that before he was Deadpool and his stint as Green Lantern, what a decade or so ago he did do another superhero outing.
He also was in Wolverine Origins, which we can talk
Yes.
about a little bit,
Mm.
where he played Weapon X or X-23. I'm never really sure which character he was supposed to be in that movie, but it was definitely his pre-Deadpool. One thing I like about Ryan Reynolds in Blade Trinity is he had gone right from his kind of Van Wilder party boy frat boy phrase, and
Mm.
he had gotten really jacked for the Amityville remake that he was in, and then he went right from the
Yes.
Amityville remake to Blade Trinity. And so all those like jacked Ryan Reynolds with like facial hair and all sweaty at night wearing pajama bottoms. Those are all
Yeah.
like horror films. And he wasn't quite Deadpool yet. He hadn't embraced going back to comedy as a hunk actor. Because he'd
Mm.
always been kind of cute, but like off-putting if you weren't into frat boys. Like a
Yeah.
Jeremy Piven you could
Yes.
actually be around rather than like a really funny actor. So yeah, that would Blade Trinity in 2004.
Mm. Ryan's energy has always been slightly unconventional. Uh, I I think for a while he tried to fit a sort of mold to be like a traditional Hollywood leading man, but I believe from what I could see from his choice of roles and what he said previously in the past, over time he started to allow himself to be himself and to embrace his little quirks and nature. Like I think he tried to do it with his role as Hal Jordan in Green Lantern, more of the Hollywood leading man trope. But then he was like, never mind this. I love Deadpool. I'm going to embrace Deadpool and make him the psycho that he was always meant to be that I failed in the first time.
I will say he did meet his wife on Green Lantern, so as much as I hate Green Lantern, it did bring him and Blake Lively together. So I
Mm,
have to give props for that. I like Ryan Reynolds as an actor. I
mm,
haven't really seen anyone do this that does fan art, but Ryan Reynolds has this thing on screen where he does kind of everything, not with innocence, but there's sort of this like twinkle in his eye where it always feels like he's in on
mm,
the joke. There's a very smart
yes.
comedic timing to what he does that reminds me a little bit of like Jerry Lewis or Danny Kaye, where it's physical, but it's definitely more internalized.
Mm,
Um, and so it's interesting because when I see fan art of him, more of it is done where it's more sketched. I don't see a lot of cartoon work for Ryan Reynolds either as Deadpool or in Blade Trinity. It's an interesting thing of how people depict these characters,
mm,
um, which is also why it's interesting to me because also in 2004 we get Spider-Man 2, we get Harry
yes.
Osborn taking the mantle of Green Goblin, or Hobgoblin, whichever Goblin he was, because there's like 14 of them now. It's like the Green
Yes.
Lantern Corps in the MCU. Um, so Harry Osborn takes over Green Goblin, and
Mm.
his Green Goblin is this mechanized, over muscle bound, very like metallic Power Ranger type suit.
Mm.
Again, the level of fan art for these two, either in shipping or it just for Harry Osborn as his like angsty haunted self, you don't see it. And it's kind of an interesting thing in that, is it
Mm,
just before people were really doing it? Is it just a
I,
forgotten thing? Like it's just something I think about.
I I do wonder about that. So in terms of like the whole tension between Toby's Spidey and that iteration of the Goblin, as you say, um I have seen some examples of fan art of it, but certainly not to the extent of that you have nowadays.
Yeah.
Um, I do wonder. So, what year did this come out again?
So,
Sorry.
Spider-Man 2, where Harry Osborn takes over the
Yes.
mantle, is in 2004.
So, so I know we had the internet back then and such, but I
Believe
do
it or not,
wonder.
dinosaurs carried the internet in 2004. We were done with GeoCities, but we weren't quite where everything was monetized yet. There still was some free
Mm,
stuff hanging around.
I I wonder whether there was some fan shipping and some fan uh, art and such done of the pair. However, it could be, as you say, that this was a period where it, as a concept, hadn't quite taken off, and what was done might have been buried within the archives of DeviantArt somewhere, or one of the message boards that we had back in the day. Um, and it just didn't get like it didn't get the notice that it does now because of the fact that it's very easy for fan artists and their followers to get this out there to everyone
Yeah.
through like social media and such. Because I mean, back then, like there was, I don't even know if Instagram was really a thing then. Facebook was very much in its infancy.
Yeah, well, you had like a live journal. Live journal communities
Mm,
were fairly big at the time. DeviantArt was pretty big. We didn't really have housing sites for photos like
mm,
Imgur, but like fanfiction.net um was up and running in 2004. I feel like, but
mm,
it wasn't really big, or if it was big, it just wasn't kind of the thing that I was around yet.
mm,
But that was back when the internet was still very much, it still had the feeling of an open playground. Things were quite monetized yet. 2004 is also an interesting thing, and my favorite Punisher had
mm.
a film come out in 2004. I absolutely adored Thomas Jane as the Punisher. I know people really like I can never remember his name. I can see him in my head, but
Oh,
Lord if I can remember his name.
I can't
He has the
quite get it myself either.
Yeah, but you know who I'm talking about. Like you can visualize the new MCU Punisher.
Yes.
Um,
Oh, whatever his name is.
I know it's gonna bug me. But Thomas Jane's Punisher also comes out in 2004. So this is like the first year we have three Marvel movies in one year. This Punisher is funny, a little absurd. I kind of had a love affair with Thomas Jane in the 2000s, and I think the Punisher was a big version of that. There's a
Mm,
torture scene in the Punisher where the guy can't see what the Punisher is doing, and he's like mimicked using all these tools, but he really has these like popsicles, and he's like
yeah.
fake torturing him with popsicles, so we'll give up information, and it's very clever and funny, but there's also something. Thomas Jane as the Punisher also had those kind of Ryan Reynolds Bambi eyes, and
Hmm.
so like when I think of Punisher films, I want to sit through and watch again. I think of this one with John Travolta as the over the top villain, but mostly for me, Thomas Jane was a more human Punisher, because Punisher comics had a Punisher, but that Punisher always kind of seemed a little too RoboCop and a little too inhuman. Thomas Jane was a anti-hero where you could actually get into it and see yourself
Hmm.
doing it, and the humor that offset the like tragedy behind Frank Castle's life. Thomas Jane did a fabulous
Yeah.
job in that for me. So
Mm. So yes, so there was that. Um, and there was actually a huge amount of other movies based on Marvel properties out around this time of the period of 2003, 2004, and like actually a couple of years prior, etc. And something that I wanted to bring up actually as a point, and this actually might explain why fan shipping and and generally like fans like imaginations of these characters might not have been so prevalent in these different films at the time. A lot of these films that were coming out were standalones or sequels very much to the characters within the films rather than an interconnected series of films. Um, so, for example, 2003, you had Ben Affleck's version of Daredevil.
Yes.
Um, you had in 2000 the very first Hulk film starring Eric Bana as the
Actually,
Hulk.
that was in 2003 is what I have. Is that the Hulk
Oh,
version from 2003? I'm double checking to see
well,
which one. So,
oh no, it
so
was 2003.
yeah, so
I
yeah,
might
this
be
is
thinking of
this
then.
is the Ang Lee one, which is like the famous movie that he did after
Oh,
Brokeback Mountain. So this is
mm,
the Ang Lee Hulk was from 2003. This is the first time because Hulk had been a presence on TV in the Marvel universe for a long time. But
yeah.
yeah, this is the Eric Bana Hulk in 2003.
Mm. Sorry, I got slightly my dates mixed up. It was the first X-Men movie by Sony that and Fox. Oh,
Yes.
was it Sony and Fox or just
No,
Fox?
so this is
Yeah.
2000. This is by 20th Century Fox. This is the Bryan Singer X-Men universe before the kind of
Yes.
first class universe.
Mm,
Yeah, the 2000 X-Men, I'd argue in the 2010s,
mm,
2000 to 2010, I'd argue the X-Men series is probably the most popular. The Bryan
mm,
Singer X-Men movies are probably the most popular Marvel property up until Iron Man, I'd
mm.
argue.
Yes. And as I was trying to touch on before, like a lot of these projects were either standalones or they were strictly kept within like almost their own series and such. And we don't see like the shift towards a multiverse kind of thing
No.
until like the MCU came out, and the MCU really did like make that a trend, which we started seeing with everyone else trying to replicate the formula, shall we say?
Well, and I think people need to recall this kind of interconnected MCU, Star Wars, everything had a sequel thing was still not a thing people were doing. I mean, Disney built a brand on doing it,
Hmm.
but superhero movies were still a relatively new phenomenon. We didn't
Yeah.
get a new one every 6 months. It was, a decade between Howard the Duck and Blade, and those were very much outlier projects. And Blade
Yeah.
wasn't even marketed as a superhero movie. I think for me, what intrigues me is that when people do fan art of Marvel, especially X-Men, they always go back to the Bryan Singer X-Men. They go back
Yes.
to Hugh Jackman at the first time as Hugh Jackman as Logan before he was super jacked, and they go back to that younger Bobby Drake. And they go
Yes.
back to James Marsden. By the way, James Marsden in Jury Duty playing like the weird Hollywood version of himself. Complete departure from Scott Summers. But if you love Scott Summers,
Mm.
like this is James Marsden for some reason got Scott Summers. I'm kind of glad he didn't play. I think he actually the reason he wasn't in X3 very much is because he did get to play Superman. But for me, he's kind of a quintessential, slightly uptight but could go dark Scott Summers. And I
Yes.
think the Gene Wolverine uh, Scott love triangle that they didn't resolve for a long time. James Marsden and Hugh Jackman really work as those two characters.
Ag- Agreed. And they're a good example of leading men. that fitted their roles so well and actually remained within the public consciousness after the films are gone. Like,
Yeah,
I brought up Ben Affleck before as Daredevil. There was also Nicolas Cage as Ghost Rider
that's
from
true.
2007.
Yeah,
I think people remember them in those roles, but they just it was just something. It's almost like a fact.
yeah.
It's not an interest.
I think if people went back and watched the Ben Affleck Daredevil movie, I think they would
Mm,
enjoy it now that we've had more exposure to Daredevil. I don't think people got Daredevil the first time they saw because he does have a Batman persona, and with the knowledge that the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles are kind of a spoof
mm,
of
yeah.
Daredevil, kind of helps.
Yes.
What's interesting for me too, if you compare Daredevil that has the same kind of dark tone, the same kind of vinyl leather feel. X-Men is something people really loved to the point where you did see a lot of fan fiction, not fan art, but in my case, fan fiction of
Mm,
Logan and Bobby, especially Bobby Drake himself, both in the comics and in these films, especially, had not come out yet. And so this
mm,
is definitely whole cloth created fan fiction.
mm,
It was very unusual at that point in time until X3 when Jean Grey had quote unquote died or was coming back. Until we got to X3, you didn't see a lot of Wolverine Cyclops stuff. But that heartbreak element that again we didn't get in Spider-Man, that heartbreak element inspired a lot of art that I saw for Wolverine and Scott. And it's just one of the things where I can't figure out what the difference was, except for
mm,
that they fought over a girl, and Harry and Toby were just kind of good friends. You know, they weren't
mm,
fighting over Mary Jane.
yes. It is tricky, and some it's interesting to see what moments stick in people's minds and what moments sort of don't.
Yeah.
Um,
I know
I
what
suppose
moment you're thinking of. I know what you're alluding to. Or you're
Mhm.
alluding to one of two things, and I think I know which one is the one you're alluding to.
Ooh, let's play a game. I'm going to allow you to see if you can guess what I'm talking about before I even mention it.
So there are two that I think you're possibly to. I'm going to take a stretch because I'm talking about Bobby and Logan that you are alluding to the infamously now gift that comes around once every 2 or 3 years scene of Bobby Drake using queer coded language to make Logan's long neck beer cold again in a way that he did not need to.
Mm,
It didn't. I would imagine it would probably break the internet if they did it now. Also, I can't imagine Marvel doing it now. And I have to wonder how much of that was improv. What's interesting is that this is queer coded subtext that you don't see in a lot of Marvel
yeah.
movies, but also it took the queer community a long time to, at least where I was from, it took them a long time to figure that out.
Yeah.
Um, and then
Mm,
it kind of took hold and it set the imagination aflame. And
yes.
that was at I always think it's in
So,
X-Men, but it's actually the opening of X2 is where
mm,
that scene is from, which
yes.
is part of the 2003 trilogy of Marvel movies that were out in 2003.
Mm.
Yeah.
So it wasn't actually that moment I was thinking of. The
Okay,
moment
that's fine.
I was thinking of is not X-Men at all. We're going back onto something else. There was a movie out in 2005
Yes.
that's another Marvel property. Uh,
Yes.
does that ring any bells?
It does. And here's an interesting thing. I'm pretty sure you're talking about Johnny Storm, Chris Evans in his first turn in the MCU.
Hmm.
Yes.
Yep.
So
That.
here's yeah.
Go. Oh,
No, go for it.
go.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, as a teenager, seeing Chris Evans waddling around in the buff in that clutching a pink parka around his midriff whilst he was happily flicking his fingers and showing how much of a flamer he was pretty very much an informative experience of my gay cinema viewing. to the point where I took my ex-boyfriend specifically to the because we were good friends at the time. I took him specifically to cinema, didn't tell him what to expect, and his eyes popped out of his skull the moment Chris was walking around like that. So
Yes.
good times.
What's interesting is that there have been several times when Chris Evans was comfortably and scantily clad on scene, quite famously in Not Another Teen Movie.
Hmm.
But after Fantastic Four, both of them, he also did things like Scott Pilgrim and The Losers. And The Losers, of course, has that scene where he's like stripping in the elevator and singing Journey. But so he's always been fairly comfortable with both his body and with doing
Mm.
superhero things. Something interesting about this is that because we're going to talk about 2011's Captain America,
Oh
because
yes.
obviously Captain America set a new standard in shipping and everything else. Um,
Hmm.
People really like Chris Evans as Johnny Storm. I will admit I had a hard time seeing him playing someone more straight laced after seeing it. So what's interesting is I really love 2005's Fantastic Four. I specifically
Mm.
love Ian Gruffold and Johnny Storm from here as a pairing as sort of like antagonistic lovers. But Reed
Mm.
Richards is one of those characters, and this is not the only time Ian Gruffold and Chris Evans worked together. They also worked together on Playing It Cool much later, where they have even more chemistry. Um, this is actually so the first Fantastic Four movie is actually a callback in a way, if we think about fandom, to Mallrats from '95. So in Mallrats in '95, these guys that hang out at the mall, they get to meet Stanley because he has a cameo in this movie, and they ask him about the male genitalia of like the Thing and Mr. Fantastic, and Stanley is like, they should maybe go see someone for their obsession. But like Mallrats to Fantastic Four is sort of this line about the obsession with what's under the superhero costume. In Fantastic Four, they do like more scatological humor with Michael Chiklis talking a little bit about how the Thing like poops, but like
Mm.
there's also this weird interesting thing where we start to see these more revealing costumes for male superheroes. We start to see more of that traditional lycra, more of
Hmm.
bulges barely being hidden by dance belts. But it's one of those things where I feel like this is really where superhero movies come into their stride. And I feel like this is where Chris Evans really does come into his stride as an actor. Like he and Ian Gruffold are going opposite directions because Ian Gruffold has had this amazing career at this point, and it's after
Yeah.
this that we start to see less Ian and more Chris. And of course, Michael Chiklis was on the Shield for years. I don't never really see much fan art from Michael Chiklis as the Thing. I don't actually see much Thing fan art as compared to Hulk fan art, which I also find very interesting.
I do see occasional stuff with the thing, but I agree with you that it's very minuscule compared to other characters. I'm not sure why that is. Um, hmm.
It's interesting because Reed Richards as Mr. Fantastic is like both very smart and very stretchy.
Yes.
So I've made some allusions to that in some of the queer art I've made, but generally speaking, it feels like
And
it's almost a bit of a taboo to not mention that. Like the only context I've ever seen for a vaguely queer Reed Richards had to do with essentially his wife and with like having people watch him do stuff to his wife. I've never actually seen queer art of Mr. Fantastic with anyone.
I've seen a little bit of queer. I have seen a little bit. Fasto did do a Mr. Fantastic X Johnny Storm art piece.
Okay,
Um, where Reed did use his stretchy powers a bit.
well, that's great.
Um, and Blitz Turner did do a Johnny Storm and the Thing. fan art a while back. Um, but no, the Fantastic Four generally, beyond what Chris Evans did with the portrayal of Johnny, and then, as you say, that a little bit of simmering tension between Reed and Johnny, and then also Reed and Victor.
Yeah,
Um, there's Victor and Reed seem like they would be perfect shipping fodder. But I suppose
yeah.
I wonder whether Doom and the Thing, because they portray quite inhuman elements. Like the Thing is very rocky, very craggy. Doom is very aloof and like almost like the Doom bots that he controls.
Yeah.
Like they're a bit detached, whereas the Hulk has always, because it's always been very angry, very bestial. It has a lot of like feral energy, and I think that does appeal to some people. So that might be why there's that contrast there.
I will say for the Fantastic Four 2005, which I implore people to go back and watch that movie as well,
Mm.
because
Yeah,
I think that's kind of a lost Marvel gem.
yeah.
The aging up of Johnny Storm, because Johnny Storm in the comics for a long time was like a preteen brother to
Mm.
Sue Storm. So it was actually pretty controversial to cast Chris Evans in the first place. The simmering tension you feel between Victor Von Doom and everybody else in the cast is because Julie McMahon had was either halfway through filming or had just finished filming Nip Tuck, so he was still kind of in that kind of super sexy headspace that his character portrayed
Mm.
for like however many years.
Yeah.
And so I think Julian Manhunt was a really adequate Victor Von Doom. Victor Von Doom is hard to play because you can go so over the top you lose complete connection, but I can
Mm.
see that. So we have 2005's Fantastic Four, which I think is actually really good. I feel really bad for liking it, if only because Jessica Alba had such a hard time on the
Mm.
set. Something interesting I find in this earlier version of MCU, especially, is that you really don't see the sexualization of the female cast members. The only sexualized female cast members of this earlier up until the point where we get to 2008, 2011 is Rebecca Romaine as Mystique, but she was in control of that sexualization the whole time in interviews where she talks about basically being painted in blue paint for Mystique, she's always very in control of that. But like a traditionally sexualized character like Storm, even Jean Grey, you don't even in 2005's Elektra, which is kind of a spin-off slash sequel to Daredevil, but not really.
Mm.
You don't even
Yeah.
really see that version of Elektra sexualized. The
Mm.
Ghost Rider, Nicolas Cage's Ghost Rider, his girlfriend is not even in a skimpy outfit. She's just there to be a damsel in distress. Mary
Mm.
Jane is never sexualized. By the time we get to Fantastic Four: Rise of the Silver Surfer, Jessica Alba, especially, we're hearing from about
Mm.
all the problems she had on set. This isn't really um, a well loved, well anticipated movie. I don't think anybody that saw Rise of the Silver Surfer really liked it that much, and I liked the idea, but I didn't like it. But then in 2008, when it looks like
Mm.
everything is going to go downhill, we do get the Edward Norton Incredible Hulk. We get Punisher Warzone, both of which are
Mm.
incredibly disliked. But we also get Iron Man in 2008. And this Iron Man and the Incredible Hulk are the first two films by Marvel Studios starting to reclaim their properties.
Mm.
I've never liked Iron Man. I will be completely transparent about it. Iron Man pairings don't do anything for me. I think he's a fine character, but he's not for me. Uh, but I don't think anyone knew in 2008. Maybe you had some inklings, but in 2008 when Iron Man came out, it didn't seem like it was going to reset an entire like group of movies in an entire genre.
Mm.
Um, how was Iron Man for you? How was Iron Man in your kind of superhero pantheon?
I enjoyed it. I thought the story was conventional. I could see where the narrative was going. However, I enjoyed um Robert Downey Jr.'s characterization of Tony Stark. He was by turns cocky, swaggering, but certainly with a great deal of flaws and vulnerability underneath everything. Um, and I think the point of him seeking to be a bit better than what he had been in the past, well, a lot better than what he had previously been, um, that really did capture people's attention. And well, the portrayal of Downey as Tony certainly did.
Yeah,
Um, I certainly didn't imagine it being the spark to start things off,
yeah.
but so I feel that Iron Man has always had very much a sort of, to use some slang terminology, some very straight masculine bro energy to it. There's a good reason why um, it got really well liked publicly. Um, like, the swaggering suit of armor, um, not taking like
The
going out
gif,
and doing your own thing.
he
So
had the gif with his arms outstretched and everything exploding behind him. That became a
yeah,
very popular reaction gif for a while.
yeah. So it kind of led from there. What was the next one after Iron Man? I forget. It was
So this was I've always loved Edward Norton. I will fully admit to my Edward Norton crush. His version of the Incredible Hulk is not well liked, and I think the reason it's not well liked is because it gets compared to Kevin Bacon in Stir of Echoes, where he
mm,
plays a very Invisible Man type. The Incredible Hulk with Edward Norton feels more like a science heavy movie in a not great way. It
mm,
doesn't embrace superhero in the way it traditionally does. I don't think so. Here's the thing: is that in 2010 and uh, from 2010 backwards, people didn't really get that invested in superhero movies. The best thing about the
yep,
first Spider-Man movie, for instance, for my generation when it came out, wasn't that Toby was playing Spider-Man. It wasn't the villainy. It had a really cool soundtrack, and that's what we
mm,
tended to gravitate toward. So, like, when I think about X-Men Origins being like the final, so X-Men Origins Wolverine in 2009, a lot of people saw it, but not a lot of people liked it. However,
mm,
I find it remarkable not because it almost stopped the MCU dead in its tracks, but because X-Men Origins Wolverine is the first time we start to sexualize the actors that play the male characters. And it
mm,
does reset the tone. It starts to be how we're going to sexualize Chris Hemsworth, Chris Evans, Chris Pratt, into some
mm,
extent Mark Ruffalo, how we're going to sexualize Michael Fassbender and James McAvoy when they start doing the X-Men prequels.
mm,
So X-Men Origins Wolverine is a turning point for the MCU, good and bad, in my mind.
mm. Oh yes, because so I'll touch on one point I just thought of now.
Yeah,
But you mentioned about McAvoy and Fassbender. At this point, when they went into the next X-Men trilogy, you do notice that there's a subtle difference within Xavier and Magneto's friendship.
yeah,
Compared to like the previous iteration, with McKellen and Stewart's versions, there's much more a subtle emphasis on fan shipping
yeah.
within the new version, and that was the reason why, if you go on, you could see there's a lot of fan shipping of this Magneto and this Xavier. Um, so my point that I thought of before that was gonna pose to you was, do you think at this point, as they're bringing out this new generation of leading men that were headlining these new MCU movies that they were starting to bring out, do you think the studio had actually taken notice and was actively trying to sort of get on this trend,
I
as it were?
think a lot of studio work fetishizes the old MGM studio system of the 1940s, where they
Mm,
had a lot of control over the image. They decided who did what. Big breakout stars like Betty Davis suffered for years because she didn't fit the mold they needed to her, and she was only
Mm,
successful really outside of that.
mm,
I think for me, looking at how they treated Hugh Jackman in Origins Wolverine and basically threw him to the wolves, while
mm,
still overly sexualizing an actor that basically morphed their body from a traditional body into this like almost inhuman wolf character. If you look at Chris Hemsworth in the first Thor movie, he is unrecognizable. Like when I look at pictures of like Chris Hemsworth now from people thirsting over his new workout video thing,
mhm,
that first Thor movie, he does not look anything like what he looks like now. How they've done his makeup is completely different, how they highlight different areas of his face. Even the exposure of his body in like Thor Love and Thunder is so different from the voyeurism scene in the fitting room changing room when he's getting the jeans in Thor 1.
mm,
Natalie Portman does a lot of great work in the Thor trilogy, and her as Jane fulfilling Jane's comic book arc with cancer is so heartbreaking and satisfying at the same time. And I have a lot to say about the Thor series because I think it's interesting. But that is going to be for another time, so we don't get.
mm.
But so here in 2010, we get to Iron Man 2, where we start to see. Also, here's an interesting point. So before we get into this, because I have something to say about Robert Downey Jr. that I find interesting.
Okay.
Is there anything that you want to do about what I'm calling Marvel movie 2.1, which is kind of all this from 1986's Howard the Duck up until Punisher Warzone, I'll say. So is there
Mm.
anything else you want to say about this kind of first part of the MCU before we start talking about the second coming, as I call it?
Not particularly, no. I'm happy to go straight into the meat of the session.
Okay. So Robert Downey Jr. was an unofficial member of the Brat Pack in the
Mm,
80s. So do you know what the Brat Pack is?
I do. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So he and Tom Cruise were both not in the Brat Pack, but were part of the Brat Pack. Like when people thought of it, they were kind of accessory Brat Pack members. So Robert Downey Jr. had this really interesting, slightly erotic late teen sort of character that he played. And I see this every now and then on Tumblr, especially when people discover the queer character he played in Wonder Boys, where he and Tobey Maguire
Mm,
slept together, with
mm,
Michael Douglas as kind of the narrator character. The book is very
yes.
different from the film. But he also played kind of this hypersexualized teen character in Weird Science as well. And
Mm, mm,
so a lot of the audiences that loved Robert Downey Jr. in Iron Man 2, as he was really starting to connect with Pepper Potts, as he was really coming into his own, as people weren't so astonished that he wasn't acting again, because he took a long break between the two and there were a lot of drugs and a lot of jail time. Um, there's just something really interesting about bringing Robert Downey Jr. back into a sexualized frame as a daddy because you don't see that a lot. It's a really new phenomenon. I think about the same way
Yes.
like Zac Efron has that same thing happen, but it doesn't always work. Like when I think about the male cast members of all that, when I think about say Kenan Thompson, who did sketch comedy as a kid and then came back to it as an
Mm,
adult, that kind of what they did to Robert Downey Jr., where they took him from heartthrob heartbeat guy to kind of cleaned up rehab Iron Man daddy. It's a really interesting thing that
yes.
is so incredibly new, and it
Mm,
does kick off. So X-Men's Origins Wolverine, we start to get Hugh Jackman super objectified in this like steroided tanked out body. He didn't take steroids, but it definitely is superhuman. But this is also the first MCU movie where we start getting those backstage clips of him wearing that dance belt in the scene where he comes up out of the water nude with all the like wires on him.
mm,
That's X-Men's Origins Wolverine. This is part of that movie's canon, part of the press release for it. This is like a more overt sexualization. There's a queer sexualization and subtext to Wolverine in the earlier X-Men movies, but it's effortless and it's not reported on Here
No.
he's objectified, and whether you like it or not, it's a big part of the movie's marketing was
Mm,
how often on talk shows he was asked about this scene and they would show him dripping coming out of the water wearing nothing but a tan skin colored bikini,
mm.
and about how the women were like taking pictures of him like they did to Jai Courtney in Suicide Squad. And it's like people are weird and prudish and they don't want the queer, like they don't bring North Star in, they don't bring Forge in, who have more of this queerness to them, to the X-Men universe. But Hugh Jackman, for some reason, it works. For some reason, it starts to work with Robert Downey Jr. by the time we get to Iron
Yes.
Man 2. And we get that scene specifically of Gwyneth Paltrow's hand literally inserting and penetrating into his body to restart his heart or put in his like purple blue glow cube thing. And there is
Yeah.
this symbolism that is both sexualization, but there's also this fascination in American media with how prudish can we be and yet how much can we sensationalize. And you really start to see this turn as we come into this like second version of MCU with how they're using actors as well as characters as product. And you don't see that with Chris
Mm,
Hemsworth at first, but by the time we get to Thor the Dark World, by the time we get to the Avengers movie season, the way that they framed him has completely changed to put him
mm,
on par with everyone else. He was already on par, but if you look at the facial shape, the muscle
mm.
tone, the face itself, how they even did the makeup around the eyes, where they put his hairline, there's a yesification of Chris Hemsworth that happens to him as Thor that we don't
Yes.
see because his movie succeeded.
Mm,
Yeah.
indeed. And then that all led to what you mentioned earlier was perhaps the movie that really started it all off, which was Captain America: The First Avenger back
So
in
here's
2011.
here's my question for you. Because yes,
Yeah,
Chris Evans, like people really got off on Chris Evans as Steve
very much so.
Rogers. Like we all
Yeah.
got off to that. There is nobody that didn't get off to that. Like straight guys were having gay moral panic over this. My question is was it actually Captain America the First Avengers that made it happen? Or was it Dark Bucky and the Winter Soldier that really made this happen? Because there's only 3 years between those two movies. So the
Yes.
question is, does Chris Evans as Steve Rogers maintain the sexiness? Do people still love it as much? Or do we need Dark Bucky to keep that going? Like, is Steve Bucky stronger than Steve by himself?
Mm, interesting. That's an interesting thought. Um, the thing is that when people look at Captain America: The First Avenger, like that scene of Steve post transformation, like, completely shirtless within the machine, sweating coming out of it. That
Panting, he's
almost,
basically having an orgasm coming out
yeah,
of a
w-
cocoon. It's a
makes
butterfly thing, really, essentially.
yeah, very much like almost like transformation into sort of a classical Grecian like um concept of what, like, a traditional man is when
Well,
they want what to do.
for a long time in Marvel Comics, he was a Greek god. He was the Greek god of courage. Like
Mm,
for there was a whole thing about him joining the pantheon because there was no one else they could think of to be the Greek god of
mm,
courage. Yeah, so it makes
yeah.
sense.
So, so the thing is, like, him doing that and then him breaking into that run to race after that agent, straight after that, like there was a huge amount of virality and vitality that was being encapsulated within Steve as a character, and that set the groundwork. You did have hints of his relationship with Bucky at the time, and like the loss of Bucky during the movie that really impacted Steve and such. And then it comes sort of around again, as you say, within the Winter Soldier, with Bucky coming back and Steve on a quest to save him. There's a lot of queer subtext encapsulated. It's not
It's
subtle.
text. It's not subtext. It's like
It's
Dean and
it,
Castiel. It's not. There's no subtext happening here.
I mean, it leads on right into further civil war, which is
Yeah.
all about his continuing quest to protect his quote unquote friend and
Yeah.
everything. Um, so it almost like Bucky really is Steve's damsel, realistically, even though Bucky doesn't need it isn't really a traditional damsel in distress. Um,
So here's two really interesting things about this culture.
mm,
Before we get Guardians of the Galaxy, this is the culture between going from Thor all the way to Guardians of the Galaxy in 2014. Not part of the X-Men. I think the X-Men First Class universe should be its own discussion in a
yeah.
separate thing because there's so much happening there, and I really want to talk about it someday. There's two things that happen. One is that Chris Evans as Steve Rogers is the most unexpected, subtle, soft, artistic, almost voluptuous version of a man. There's something Botticellian
Mm,
about him. When people describe Steve Rogers in those first movies, especially, they don't do tanked out, they don't do roided out, they don't give him a Hulk physique. There's something very soft and artistic. There's a focus on Chris Evans, not just on his ass, but on his mind and his courage. And this is way different from the comics. Steve Rogers in the comics is this rigid Boy Scout. He's, Jensen Ackles is Soldier Boy without the pot, essentially.
mm,
And that had always been a critique of how can you put this on screen? This is a one-dimensional character meant to represent, American imperialism,
mm,
which, whether or not is correct, is the thing going on at the time. What Chris Evans does as Steve Rogers is completely doesn't just subverts the male gaze, but leans into it. That
mm,
being said, I don't know how comfortable he was because he read in those early interviews as a little more shy about Steve than he did as about Johnny Storm, who was just very cavalier and wasn't, even though he ran around in less clothing, he was somehow less sexualized. To me, Johnny Storm was way less sexualized than Steve Rogers was, in my mind, in a
mm,
lot of ways. Uh, so that's the first thing, is that this is a completely new version of Steve Rogers that will lead into US Agent, that will lead into a new version of Sam, that
mm.
will change even how we look at Bucky, because Bucky in the comics was pretty straight in a relationship with Natasha. If
Mm,
people thought of him as all, they thought of him the same way they thought of the grown up Nightwing, where it's more of a spy epic, much closer to S.H.I.E.L.D., much more about like the spy versus spy aesthetic and like the Russian part of the Marvel Universe. The other thing that starts to happen here too is we start to see kind of the home version of the Avengers, especially get to the first Avengers movies. We start seeing the everybody lives in Avengers Tower on their own floor and they hang
mm.
out all the time and they have Pop Tarts. We haven't seen the cuddlification of Loki yet. So Loki is sometimes there, but often not. So here in 2012, this is when fandom really starts to come alive. This is what happened in
Yes.
2009 with Glee as well. So we have Super Hulock, we have Glee, we have the Hunger Games, and we have the Avengers. This is like the perfect storm of all this fan art and fan fiction being created at one time. The
Yes.
Avengers goes into a space where, unless you're doing queer art, it's not sexual. Most of the Avengers stuff that I saw had to do with the idea of these superpowered people living together in like this almost friends-esque brownstone. So unless you were shipping Steve and Tony or shipping Steve and Bucky, um, or even in my case, sometimes seeking out like Steve and Thor ships because they're so out of time, which is a pretty rare ship, but it's one I think works well.
Mm,
Um, there's this idea of, in the Marvel universe, superheroes are so normalized that you can create a sitcom like atmosphere for them,
mm.
and there's a fan base for it. And it's something we
Yeah.
don't really ever
Well,
get in a Marvel movie, which is really
yeah.
until about probably WandaVision, I would say we don't get that sitcom life. Um,
Mm.
yeah,
Didn't Vanessa Hudgenson do a comedy sitcom about an insurance agent in the superhero world?
there was, but
Was it
that
called
was like
Powers?
Yeah,
or something.
that was like a one season one off kind of Agents of Shield esque thing. I think Chris Dowd was in it. One of the minor Chris's was in it. Yeah, so
Mm,
that did exist, but none of the major Avenger characters were ever involved in
mm, mm.
that. Yeah,
Yeah. So yeah, we get to the actual Avengers movie, which to this day is such a, to my mind, one of those great little movies that perfectly encapsulates to my mind what a comic would actually look like if it was done
yeah.
as a movie. For all of its positives and its flaws, it did feel very much like the perfect accumulation of what had been building up to this point. Um, and it was continuing that theme of interconnectedness and actually starting to really push that going forward, because that led on to, was it phase two or phase three? I get
I
lost
think it
with
was
which one it
still.
is.
I think this
um
was phase two at that point. They weren't running
yeah,
through phases like they were running out of toilet paper or
yeah.
something like that.
so
Yeah,
So Avengers led straight on to Age of Ultron and also all of the other ones. We start to see a big, and I think because we were seeing a lot of different characters having interactions and guest stars starting to pop up here and there from
yeah.
different Marvel movies, that really helped took off both the shipping and establishing these actors in their roles, particularly as leading lights. I mean, if you think about it, certain actors were being seen, what, at least once, twice a year in major
Yes.
movies. Um, and
So
we hadn't really seen that before.
here's an interesting thought too, because we're going to
Mm,
get to the place where we're going to start looking at Guardians of the Galaxy and Ant-Man and smaller
mm,
properties coming up that are really obscure parts of Marvel canon. But Hawkeye, except for like work that Randy Meeks is doing, and now some stuff
mm,
that Pineapple Breads has done, and some stuff Rosif has done, which if we ever do X-Men First Class, I'd love to talk about Rosif and their kind of pop culture Liechtenstein
mm,
like 80s take on the X-Men, which I absolutely love. Um,
mm,
we don't ever really see Jeremy Renner's Hawkeye get the kind of popularity and the sexualization
mm.
that Loki gets as a
No.
villain. Paul Bettany as Vision. Vision doesn't become as popular. He kind of remains a side character, and like it just seems like people made a choice actively to say Robert Downey Jr., Chris Hemsworth, and Chris Evans are the sexy, and then Chris Pratt, unfortunately, which I have lots of
Mm.
feelings about, which we'll get
Yeah,
to. We'll see if we get them. We may actually need to do a second episode of this at some point because
because
he's right there in time. Yeah,
we haven't even touched on Tom Holland yet, who pretty much became a major part of the whole. Like there was fan shipping before, but as soon as you added in Spidey Twink to the mix, it
yeah.
just fan shipping went feral. I think we might have to
Which
do a part two. Yeah.
which is fine because I
Mm,
think the MCU is something really interesting. Like I said earlier, they were trying to mimic the MGM 1940s star system
mhm.
where they
Yeah.
had control over it. And of course, Disney as a conglomerate owns both Star Wars and Marvel now. So they have all of that control over all these properties. But
Mm,
there's something interesting about bringing in all this beefcake, bringing in these really complex female characters,
mm,
but people got so stuck. Yeah, until Loki was part of the TVA. Even Loki was not really like in that same tier. People just, especially the Steve Tony versus the Steve Bucky, the people that basically were trying to morph how Steve transitioned into the future, which of course then that final Avengers movie completely destroys his character because they can't
mm,
let a superhero even be bisexual.
mm.
Um, but it's one of those things where, like, also, I don't want to leave out Andrew Garfield, not just
No.
because he came back for Spider Verse, but because after this poor movie, the same year the Avengers comes out, which is like the biggest movie of that year, the Amazing
Yeah.
Spider-Man with Emma
Yes.
Stone and Andrew Garfield comes out. That poor movie, it was never gonna succeed. Like, what were you thinking? Save it a year. Like, you could have moved the Wolverine up to 2012 and brought the Amazing Spider-Man down, and I think we would have had completely different viewpoint of it.
Yes.
But Andrew Garfield. So I love this theory too in the Spider-Man universe. Just as an aside, is that every time we get a younger Spider-Man, we get a younger Aunt May. So Toby's
Mm,
Aunt May is like ancient. And then we get Sally Field as Andrew Garfield's Aunt May, and she's younger. And then Tom Holland's Aunt May is like a Marissa Tomei, and people were like shipping her with Tony Stark. And I'm like, we can't keep making eventually eventually Peter Parker has to be appropriate age. Like that's why I liked the animated movie that did the Peter B. Parker that was voiced by Jake Johnson from New
yeah.
Girl, because I feel like eventually you have to have an appropriately aged Spider-Man and you need to give him a break. But yeah, so we get the Avengers in 2012. I do think if they had released it in 2013,
Yeah.
even with the Wolverine and Thor the Dark World there, because people just didn't like Thor the Dark World, the Amazing
Mm,
Spider Man probably would have gotten more out of the MCU. And I think they might be bringing Garfield back in for more, but now people
yeah.
don't seem to be having as much fun as they were then, too. People were having fun at these movies back in 2012. It doesn't feel like that anymore to me.
No. Okay. A lot of thoughts about what everything that you just said.
Yes. Well, we'll have an
I will
episode. We'll,
give
we'll
you
do a part two. The DC. We'll push the
yeah.
DC out. We've got plenty of time. We'll do
I
a part
feel
two of Marvel next time. It's fine.
I feel Andrew Garfield does deserve a bit more attention from us. And I feel that we should, considering like it's the same period as the movies we're starting to discuss, like Guardians. Um, yeah, let's revisit that in the part two to give it some proper analysis. Because that's what I wanted to do with this. I wanted not just to look at MCU. MCU clearly is the dominant factor, and it's the one that a lot of people are very aware of. But I did want to do, as we've done, to give some attention to what everyone else was doing with the Marvel properties beforehand and also concurrently, like
Yeah.
with the Amazing Spider-Man. And we can touch upon the X-Men briefly, because what we see happening in the X-Men is they start to sort of like almost go in the opposite direction. They make them younger and sort of like elevate some characters to be new mentor roles and other ones that previously were the same age to be their mentees, which
Yeah.
is a whole weird kettle of fish. Um,
So
but
something I like about this era specifically, which I kind of want to be my final thought, so that you can do your thoughts.
okay,
Um, I love this era of the MCU specifically because it has a musical quality to it. Not in the actual music is good, although the actual music is pretty good, but there's something
mm,
about how they frame the Avengers, especially how they do X-Men First Class, um,
mm,
that has not a soundtrack feel to it, but there's something grandiose in that very 80s Andrew Lloyd Webber Phantom of the Opera Les Mis sort of way. And so there's something about these movies where people are glomming onto them in the same way that dudes who are afraid of loving musicals love Rock of Ages, which is a rock opera. And so there's something very musical about, especially things like the Avengers and Captain America Winter Soldier, that you don't
yeah,
see much in the MCU now because they have absolutely no time to make it happen.
mm,
Yeah.
yeah. So I think in the next one, what we'll do, our starting point will be sort of post um the first Avengers movie. Um, we'll go from there because that's a good point. It's gonna open up, start to go into the wider circles like Guardians, Avengers 2, um, and as you say, like start to bring in like minor properties and such. And what we that will be interesting to see sort of how the leading men in those movies are handled. Um,
Yeah.
Certainly, like I instantly come to mind um, with I forget his name. The chap that played Scott Lang in Ant-Man. His name is Paul Rudd. That's it.
All right. Yeah.
Sort of like Paul Rudd's quite, dare I say, gratuitous shirtless scene in there, which did
Yeah,
do
but
the rounds quite a bit at the
if
time.
you've seen him in like Wet Hot American Summer, you know how gratuitous he likes to be. So here's
um,
something to think about
mm,
going into too is that technically we're in phase two. Captain America Civil War is the start of phase three in 2015. So we're still in the smack dab in the middle of phase two right now.
mm,
And so if you think of it as acts or as phases, this is still not quite them finding their feet, but I would argue we're at the height of Marvel power in phase two because this is where people are still hanging on every word. We're going to start to get Black Panther, where we actually start to see diversification in our heroes, thankfully. Um, and it's an exciting. It still felt like an exciting time to be a fan of superhero
yes.
movies and of
Mm.
beefcake men in scantily clad vinyl leather and lycra.
That is a good point what you said about diversification, and that was a point that I wanted to eventually discuss within this. The fact that we're moving from what was a period where the leading men were, dare I say, very sort of like classical takes on what superheroes looked like.
I
You
mean, they
know,
were white. They
Thor.
were all white dudes. Really?
Yeah, we're gonna start what we're moving into, which is good, which is great, is we're gonna start to see some of the diversity, but then it'll be great also to see what sort of tropes remain despite their attempts to diversify.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but I think that might be a good point to leave this on then.
I think it's a good point.
Mm.
But because this will be like at least a two series episode, I want people to have something to stop and think about at the end of this. So I'm
Mm.
going to propose this question, knowing how divisive it is and knowing that a lot of people could comment. Who, up to this point, up to Avengers, who do you deem the hunkiest of the Marvel superheroes thus far and why? So up until I will say Andrew Garfield Spider-Man, because that's where we're stopping. So no Tom Holland, no Paul Rudd, no Chadwick Boseman yet. So for you, who is the hunkiest? Who do you relate to? Who do you think is the most sexually appealing? Who would you want to play housewife to or house husband or, you know, come home every day to see from work kind of thing. So that's a question I want to leave both for the audience and for you if you dare to dream an answer as to who in this kind of first two phases
Mm.
would your hunky dreamboat be?
Who's going to sweep me off my feet to rescue me from a burning building? Okay. I shall have a think about that because I don't want to put anything across that will influence our listeners.
I will influence listeners. I'm even though I struggle with kind of the lack of diversity, I do think Chris Evans and Steve Rogers for me, not just in artwork but in portrayal, is
Mm.
so incredibly different but still honors the comics. As much as I love Robert Downey Jr., he always felt a little bit on the nose as Tony Stark. I always had a little bit of problem with Tony Stark. I'm also a big Venom fan, so eventually we are going to get to talk about Tom Hardy as Venom, which
Hmm.
sets everything on fire for me. Um, I do think that as much as people love Chris Evans as Johnny Storm and want to see him in that role again, and weirdly kind of ship Chris Evans with himself as Johnny Storm and Captain America,
Hmm.
I do think, barring Mark Ruffalo's performance as the Hulk, which I think is very nuanced, and I think something like World War Hulk would be really interesting with him as Bruce, I cannot stop thinking about Chris Evans as Steve Rogers.
Mm.
Like everything that Chris Evans has done has been really interesting, playing it cool, Snowpiercer, the Knives Out movie he did as Ransom. But for me, I cannot get Steve Rogers in that soft, artistic, and yet with the possibility of being this kind of protectively violent, loving person. Like I can't get that Steve out of my head because it's so different from the Boy Scout that it could have been in other hands. And it's such a great counterpoint to like US Agent and to the guy that played Punisher that wasn't Thomas Jane. And it's such a counterpoint to what I read now in the MCU as sort of the subjectification of violence as a means to an end, because he feels so different tonally. Oh, let's make a note. I also want to talk about Phil Coulson, because I think Phil Coulson is a very important. Phil and Maria, I think, are really important side characters, as well as Nick Fury. So I'm making a note of that. But I think Phil Coulson, especially, we should talk about. But we'll talk about that next time. We got a minute left. If you'd like to have the final word.
The only thing I shall say is I hope that you have enjoyed this little stroll down memory lane of hot men of yonder, and we're going to enjoy looking at more in the next episode.
Indeed, we're going to have a great time. Thank you, Magnus. Enjoy the first part of your birthday month, because we have a whole month to celebrate you, and I'm very excited to celebrate you.
Indeed. Okay, take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye, everyone.